All right. Well, good morning. Here we are, day two. This is what you need to do. You need to watch this. You need to take notes over it. You need to read 235 to 238. This is the section on Africa. I hope you guys have had a wonderful day so far. I hope you're being safe. I hope you're staying warm. If you need anything, let me know. Um, if I was a betting man, I'd say this will not be the only time we are out also. So you may hear from me again tomorrow, maybe even the next day. I don't know. We'll just have to see. But to that end, let's cover Africa today. Get a drink, get some coffee, and let's sit down. Let's learn about Africa. We're going to briefly do Africa 1750 to 1900. It'll be short, sweet, and easy. We got to stay caught up, though. I have no time to waste. You do not either. So, well, let's hit it. Okay, here we go. This is what you need to know about Africa during this time. So, though historically Africa had been the victim of the slave trade, especially the unit just before, Africa will really remain comparatively free. Less than 10% of the continent is controlled by Europeans directly until like the 1880s, especially after the Berlin Conference, where Europeans come together under the invitation of Otto von Bismarck to carve out the continent for themselves, save for Ethiopia and Liberia. So the old rulers that did have some control on the continent, like the Ottoman Empire, the Omani Arabs, Benin, Dahomey, Congo, and the Ashanti Kingdom, they're going to lose their power wholesale by the end of this unit to Europeans. There would be attempts at unified movements of resistance against the Europeans. Most of those would really fail. The slave trade would end. The United Kingdom and France would end up controlling most of Africa and spar on and off with Germany, right? So some terms you need to know that we will cover throughout this. Rubber and rubber plantations in Africa, especially the Congo, which is a Belgian colony. It started as a private company under King Leopold II, who was the Belgian king. Samori Toure, who was the emperor of the Wasulu Empire in West Africa, he would lead a war against the French and be defeated. The Sokoto Caliphate would align themselves with the Ashanti Empire. You may remember the Ashanti from the previous unit, an empire in West Africa. Remember us talking about the golden stool and how that represented the king's power, and this was very important. Well, yes, you need to remember that the Sokoto Caliphate, a Muslim group, a Muslim state in West Africa, will align themselves with the Ashanti Kingdom, and in a long protracted war, like 80 years of fighting with the British. We call this war the Asatawa sometimes war, or sometimes called the War of the Golden Stool. Very interesting. No, it is not whenever you have had too much nacho fries at Taco Bell. Not that War of the Golden Stool. This is the War of the Golden Stool. That stool of the Ashanti Kingdom, or the Asatawa War. In South Africa, there's a group that unifies by 1828 under their ruler Shaka, and that's the Zulus. And the Zulus will fight against the Boers, the Dutch settlers in South Africa, but also the British settlers in South Africa. They will finally be pacified, though, in the Zulu War of 1879. There's some wonderful movies about this. Zulu Dawn, just really, I think in that movie, it's the Battle of Rorke's Drift, where the British are able to repel a Zulu invasion, Zulu attack, I should say. But there's another one, I think it's just called Zulu. Maybe I have the movie name backwards, but they're both British movies from like the 60s and 70s, good movies. And in this one, it shows the Battle of Iswanda, where they are destroyed. The British are destroyed. One of the biggest British defeats in Africa. The British will suffer other defeats, like in the modest wars against the Mahdi, an Islamic leader in present-day Sudan, who actually defeats the British at Khartoum. and they will not be able to defeat the Mahdists for another 18 years until the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. And that's actually when Samori Touré is defeated by the French. So 1898 is kind of a turning point there for French and British solidification of their control. And we'll also look at some other rebellions and revolts like the Oksha, the X's silence, like Hoksha cattle killing movement, which is a millenarian revolt, not unlike the Pueblo revolt or the ghost dance. Millenarian revolts are religiously motivated or tied revolts, native revolts to power, especially from European colonists. And the Osha cattle killing movement we'll look at later. So this time is for Africa. We're looking at this, historians call this the scramble for Africa as European powers attempt to take over, control Africa. And this is really going to happen 1885, and the whole of Africa is really taken care of, not even within 13 years. By the turn of the century, Africa will be firmly under the foot of European powers. So you look on the map on the left, this is Europe effectively up until the Berlin Conference, up until 1884. The big brown is the Ottoman Empire. But you remember from yesterday's lecture that this is just nominal control. The Ottomans really don't control Sudan and Egypt, which is this part. They really don't control Morocco, Libya, Tunisia. They are semi-autonomous, right? Remember, Egypt it's kind of its own show under Muhammad Ali. And so even though this brown is the Ottoman Empire, it's not really under any control. This big yellow blob is Ethiopia, and Ethiopia will remain independent until World War II. They will defeat Italy several times. Italy will finally defeat them in World War II, though. This pink you see here, that is the Portuguese. This is Angola. Remember, it's talking about Queen Nzinga and her work in Angola. And this is Portuguese Mozambique. And then you just see a little scatterings here and there of British, French, Dutch colonies. But look, most of Africa is independent, at least, right? But that all changes. Germany's now unified. Otto von Bismarck wants to get Germany in on the imperial game. And so what happens is he calls a conference and invites major world leaders. The United States shows up, actually, to the Berlin Conference in 1884. And within a year, they have carved out Africa. They draw these borders. They don't take into account any of the native geography, tribal borders, anything. They just divide it up how they want it. And then they agree on who controls what. And they set up rules for colonialism in Africa. It's really just a very interesting, very social Darwinist, right? The white man's burden. Here's this land we gotta go take care of. Let's go take care of it. Let's not ask anyone there. No one from Africa was invited to the conference, right? So what he's attempting to do is get Germany involved, right? But also help maintain the balance of power because they foresee in the colonial future conflict. And it does work for some time, but conflict is going to come up nonetheless. And that is the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, called by Otto von Bismarck in Berlin, Germany, an attempt to keep and maintain the balance of power, and the scramble for Africa goes, right? Now, we do need to talk about some of the African states that were rocking and rolling prior to this, prior to 1884. The largest of them, I'll just mention briefly. The first one is the Barbary states. You see this on the north coast of Africa. It was an autonomous Ottoman province, and they were very wealthy in trade and piracy, especially from the pirates, the Barbary pirates called the Corsairs. And they routinely threatened European and American shipping, boarding them, especially at the key choke point of Gibraltar. In fact, the British will keep and maintain a base there to this day at this choke point here, Gibraltar, just because this is a critical choke point. If you want to get from Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean, this is where you have to go, right? But then you also have right here the building of the Suez Canal. So this is a major artery of trade on the water. And so pirates make a lot of money there. The USA will actually in like 1803 say, no, we're not doing that. And they send over submarines right? And they actually take out some Barbary princes and stuff and protect some shipping there. This is where we get in the Marines hymn from the halls of Montezuma. That's the Mexican-American War to the shores of Tripoli. Here we are, right? Tripoli, right? So the Marines stepping up, the young United States, getting involved in wars in North Africa, but also instigates the French right here to invade this area, Algeria, to shut down the piracy and the Barbary, the Barbary pirates. The Ottomans aren't doing anything; they're too weak, and so the French are like, fine, if we got to take this place over, we will. The U.S., if we got to fight, we will. Right. So that's the Barbary pirates. And then our old friend from the past unit, the Ashanti Kingdom. Remember, here in West Africa, they're making a lot of money off of slavery and gold and salt, right? And so they are a rich kingdom, and they actually have a huge bag, and they build up a modern military. But by this time, the middle of the 19th century, the middle of the 1800s, uh, most states have abolished slavery. England will be in 1833 in its empire, the United States, 1865, and then Brazil, 1888. So this is the era of abolition. The Ashanti make a lot of money, though, off of enslaving their own people. And so they will actually threaten militarily European and American anti-slave ships and groups because the British, the French, the Americans at 1808 in the U.S. Constitution, slavery the importation of slavery is protected until 1808. Immediately after that, it is banned. And so Americans are financing and building a navy to fight initially like slave ships, as well as the British and the French, right? And so this is cutting into the Ashanti's profits. And so they actually come out against this. And so a lot of anti-slave fighting by these ex-slave countries against the people they were making money from is taking place here. Very interesting how this works. But they will have nearly 80 years of war with the British who settle here. And that is that War of the Golden Stool, the Asatawa War. And it is fighting on and off. This uprising against the British, though, it really fails. And the Gold Coast right here will remain a British colony until like 1957. Yeah, 1957. This is interestingly not in your textbook, but it's very important. It is on the course exam description. So I don't know why it's not in the textbook by the guy who wrote the test. Maybe it's just, something in there. Here you have a stool. Remember the golden stool? Most historians believe it probably would have been clad in gold, thus the golden stool. But the stool is highly symbolic of the chief's power, right? And so we don't really know, why. Places of seating are very important in these African cultures in the West. It's interesting. I know you won't forget that name, the War of the Golden Stool. You have here a cavalryman of the Ashanti Kingdom about 1820. In this picture, he has spears. They had modern weapons, though. They had spent a lot of money and had actually exchanged some of their goods for weapons. You see here British who have taken the capital. The name is escaping me right now. Of the Ashanti, this was a fort at the capital after they take it by like the 1890s. So that is the Ashanti Kingdom, very rich. They were pro-slavery against the people who had been pro-slavery, now are anti-slavery. And the British go so far as to fight them and take them over, the Asantewaa War, the War of the Golden Stool. Now in South Africa, there is a group called the Zulu, who had been originally those Bantu people. Remember the Bantu migrations? That's back in Unit 0. But they have unified under a warlike chief. His name is Shaka Zulu, by 1828, and have unified into a collective state there in South Africa. And so they are growing. You can kind of see this map. This is a modern day dispersion of Zulu language, of the Bantu Zulu language in South Africa. And so this area they call Natal, Natal. Still to this day, they call it that. And they're going to clash with the original colonists there, the Dutch. Remember, the Dutch show up in the Cape Colony Those are the Boers. You must know that term, the Boers. And then later, British settlers. This would become a British settler colony. And so during the Napoleonic Wars, of course, the Dutch are invaded, controlled, taken over by Napoleon. Well, after that, Britain, like, oh, we saved everyone, so Britain takes South Africa from the Dutch. And so British settlers start moving in here. Well, the Boers we'll get to this later, but the Boers will move up. They start fighting with the Zulu. The British start fighting with the Zulu. They fight on and off again for like 80 years until they are finally taken out in the Zulu War of 1879. We'll look at that later, though. Oh, our old friend Zanzibar. It's only been mentioned in every unit we've ever talked about. Remember, Zanzibar is an island here, but it controls part of the coast the Swahili coast, the Swahili city-states that are unified. They call this region the Zanj, just this green part of the coast here. Today, it's like the coast of modern Tanzania. Remember, they are a key trade hub along the Indian Ocean trade, and they're trading spice and sugar, slaves as well. It was independent, remember, but Portugal takes it over as Portugal is establishing their trading post empire, but Portugal will lose it in like 1689 to the Omani Arabs, who will control most of the East African and like Saudi Arabian coast here. They actually make it their capital for a time. Very Muslim place. There's a lot of mosques still today, these beautiful religious buildings. Remember, a mosque is a Muslim church, Muslim house of worship. Germany will show up and actually take control here by the end of this unit. So that's Zanzibar. And then Ethiopia is independent. Right, Ethiopia will actually defeat an Italian invasion in the 1890s at the battle. This is a depiction of King Menelik, I believe. You may have to check me on that. And this is where the Italians are defeated at the Battle of Adawa. And it's a big blow to the new modern Italian Europeans. They lose to the Ethiopian kingdom. The guy's riding on a horse, right? So it's a stunning defeat for the Italians. But they're very different. See, in this East Africa, some of them is kind of the Middle East still, right? They're very Christian. We call this Coptic Christians. Remember that. So if you see like Ethiopian art and it has crosses, that's why. And they have a very rich biblical manuscript tradition that still exists even to this day. So they're kind of surrounded and isolated for that reason. They're kind of the odd one out in Muslim East Africa. But they entered the world stage by defeating early Portuguese attempts at colonization. So they beat the Portuguese, they beat the Italians. And so they're able to do this because they build their military, they westernize, they have a king, Theodore II, I believe, who actually pushes for heavy militarization and westernization. And so some Europeans consider them like the least, I guess, among equals because they're Christian and somewhat modern, which is unique for East Africa, right? And so they will be independent, like I said, until World War II. We'll get to that later. And then Italy will come back for revenge. Let's talk a little bit about South Africa. So remember, the Dutch Boers had settled there originally. And the British will take over after Napoleon. And settlers start coming into this new settler colony, South Africa. Well, the Boers don't like it, so they head north, and they call this northern migration the Great Trek, the Great Trek. And so settlers and Boers are clashing during this Great Trek, but really what's happening is the whites are fighting the native blacks, the Hoksha and the Zulu tribes. And the story goes that, well, this first part's not a story. The settlers and the Boers were bringing in cattle from back in Europe. Well, when we start moving animals around, diseases spread. And there was a lung disease that was spreading amongst the cattle, and it was killing all of them, the native cattle. And the Oksha were a cattle people. They were herdsmen. And so all their stuff is dying. And so the story goes that there was a young woman who goes into a field one day and sees 3 spirits. And the spirits come back and they tell, she's like the daughter of a Hoksha chief and prophet. his name's really long. I can't remember it off the top of my head. I think it starts with a Q or a W, but if you want to look that up. But she says the spirits tell her that if they destroy all of their crops and kill all of their cattle, then they will be victorious in their rebellion against the Boers and the British settlers. And so this sparks the Oksha cattle killing movement. This is an example of a millenarian revolt, a religiously inspired or tied revolt against these European colonists. It doesn't work, and they kill these cattle, they uproot their crops, and then they have devastating famine, of course, and many of the Oksha actually die because of this. It's not a good deal. The cattle killing movement does not work, right? You could compare this to the Pueblo revolt we have also discussed. You can compare this to the ghost dance. Remember the Native Americans, you may remember Jack talking about the ghost dance. The Native Americans will, from about the same period, 1880 to 1914, I believe, attempt to resist the American imperialist move west through the ghost dance, where they believe that they can conjure up the spirits of ancestors to protect them from bullets and to fight against the Europeans, and not the Europeans, the Americans. This doesn't work, and so they are pushed onto reservations. Again, another example of a millenarian revolt. The Pueblo revolt. Remember, there's a leader, Pope, in modern-day New Mexico, 1680, religiously inspired revolt because he claims to be their religious leader that will lead them to freedom, like a Moses figure. Initially successful, but the Spanish quickly put it down. Good. And so the Zulu, they go through a brutal war, the Zulu War of 1879. They get a win on the British, the Battle of Islavanda, but the British will make some important moves like the Battle of Rorke's Drift and others where they're able to solidify their authority. They push the Zulu into a sort of reservation, if you will, and they still exist there today. Like there's a Zulu king and everything. It's pretty cool if you want to look into that. But here's the thing, the British really want to solidify their control in South Africa because they have found a lot of gold and diamonds, luxuries that everyone wants, right? It makes them a lot of rich. Still today, there are diamond and gold mines in South Africa. People are making major bag on. And so you see here, you see some Boer settlers in a colorized photo. This is a depiction of the Great Trek. So the Dutch Boers moving, running into the Zulu, the Oksha, in various battles. You see here the British who are fighting actually the Boers, a depiction of that. And then you see British soldiers fighting the Zulu warriors. Now this depiction is very correct. They had shields and spears. They also did use modern weapons like guns and stuff that they had gotten a hold of. You'll notice by this time the British, so in the earlier fighting, the British have kind of their classic red and blue and stuff. It is during conflicts with the Boers, like the Boer War, that the British will make a move to start using colors that don't stick out on the field as firearms are improving and shooting is improving, especially the Dutch Boers, who are known kind of famously as sharpshooters. And they'll start wearing like field khaki to kind of blend in. Early attempts at camouflage, right? More modern attempts of more modern battlefield techniques because of fighting that's happening here against the Boers and the Zulu. But yes, the millenarian rebellions or revolts, these are very important. You must know these because it's an example of how natives resisted European imperialism. Again, these are religiously inspired or tied resistance against conquest or control by colonials or imperialists. This is essential to know for the test. What you need to know is they were generally very limited. And so we've talked about the ghost dance, the Pueblo revolt, and the Oksha cattle killing movement. But we'll also discuss the Taiping Rebellion, the Modest Wars. We'll look at the Modest Wars and the Maji Rebellion during this unit. But when we get to East Asia, we'll talk about the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion. Some historians consider the Taiping Rebellion like the deadliest war fighting in world history, even more than like World War II. We don't know how many died. Like the most conservative estimates put it 30 million. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. But don't forget the ghost dance, Pueblo's revolt, and the Oksha cattle killing movement that we have already discussed. So the French are going to get in on the imperial game as well. You can see here the French possessions at their peak in Africa, most of West Africa, but including Madagascar. This little bit is called Djibouti, and a critical choke point here on the Red Sea. The Indian Ocean meets the Red Sea. But West Africa, large expanses all over the place. Remember, they conquer Algeria, and they consider this like their crown jewel. It's like India to Britain, and they will control it until the 50s, right? 1950s. That's a very brutal, long, hard fought campaign. They will also initially build the Suez Canal and effectively kind of control the Khedives in Egypt, but the British will take it over by the 1880s. So how are Europeans like the French able to do this? Well, some of this we've talked about, like new medical inventions, like quinine. You see here soldiers taking anti-malarial quinine by mouth to treat malaria, which killed you, which it's a disease in the belly of the mosquito. And when they bite on to suck your blood, it's a little protozoa that goes in. And what it does is it eats your blood cells. So you become very weak and your body cannot stay oxygenated and people die from it. It destroys the liver and all sorts of stuff. Now, natives here have some resistance to it, partly sometimes because of sickle cell, where we see in even African Americans, those of African descent have sickle-shaped blood cells that are not easily destroyed by malaria. It's very interesting. Of course, Europeans, whites, do not have this trait, so they have to take quinine, which is a plant. It's a phytochemical, actually. And that's, remember, we drank tonic water. It had quinine in the tonic water. That's what kind of gives it that bitter taste. Not enough for medicinal purposes, though. Also, sterilization. This is a rough place to be. And back then, if you're in an unknown land, you fall and break your leg, you dead, right? Not because you couldn't heal your broken bone, but because if you got like just a bad cut, you're infected and you die. But new sterilization and surgical techniques that we had looked at, right, are able to help with that, like Lister's sterilization techniques, the treatment of wounds, pasteurization. Louis Pasteur's pasteurization of foods and stuff is making the treating of not just foods, but other things through the same process of sterilization is able to help in the medical field, right? Steam-powered transportation like railroads. They'll start building railroads in their colonies and steamboats to go up and down the Nile and across some big lakes like Lake Victoria here in East Africa. Steam-powered transportation is making encroachment in Africa a lot easier. Of course, their knowledge is increasing, partly because of missionaries early on. New weapons like the machine gun, stuff like the automobile. I mean, it's just advancements that took place other places are now working here. They'll start to establish telegraphs, right? And so I can sit in London and administer my colonies from London, and I can tell them what to do in seconds, right? Because of new underwater cables, telegraph cables, eventually the phone and the radio. So these new technologies we discussed are just now coming to Africa, right? You see here a French postcard from 1900. We have a French soldier here. Look at this. And it says down here, use quinine if you wish to see them again. So we have the French soldier here. He's come back from the Orient, returned from the Orient. So he was in Africa or maybe Vietnam, another French colony, remember, by 1888. And he wants to come back to his beautiful family, his wife, his kids, his farm. He better use the quinine so he don't get malaria and die, right? Now, how are these places making money? Where can I go that I'm not in the way? I may have to move it. It's kind of the same old thing, monoculture plantations and resource extraction. Well, I mean, we looked at gold and diamonds. They're also getting ivory from the elephant and the rhino, and that's their tusk, right? The ivory is kind of like the keratin on our nails, but it's a lot thicker and prettier, especially when they polish it, and they make beautiful decorations from ivory. Ivory is still wanted today, even though they've said like you can only kill so many elephants and rhinos and stuff by poachers. People are poaching them. And so a lot of elephants and rhinos died because of the ivory trade. legal and illegal. But the two major cash crops, especially in West Africa and Central Africa, are rubber and palm oil. Palm oil from palms. They take the fruit and they condense and distill the oil, and they use it for fuel, food, all sorts of stuff, right? If you've had donuts from Daylight Donuts, they cook it in palm oil. Palm oil is good for deep frying of confections. And rubber is increasingly demanded, especially after the process of vulcanization, correct, is created, where through heating, cooling, and chemicals, they can make rubber into tires for new machines, into bumpers and insulators for new technologies, and even as thin as gloves, right? So they're using rubber for everything. And so there's a rubber boom, if you will. And so there's a guy, Leopold II, here he is right here, and there's the rubber tree. They gird the tree, the sap comes down. That's where they get it from, the coconut palm, the ivory. Anyway, there's a guy, he's the king of Belgium in the 1870s. His name is Leopold II, and he actually establishes a private company, but he'll then like bequeath it to the Belgian state. And they have this, Belgium has this large colony, the Belgian Congo, in the middle. Today, it's the modern country of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But all throughout these Belgian elites will have these monoculture plantations for the cash crop rubber. They use, it's slavery, basically. Your book calls it semi-coerced labor. It's slavery. I mean, they didn't have to work there, but where else are they going to go, right? And in an effort to meet like rubber quotas and stuff, they treated them very bad, famously even cutting off their hands, their right hand, to make a show of them. Here's the thing, if I cut off your right hand and then tell you keep farming rubber, you're not going to make it. So having your right hand cut off is a death sentence, right? And they're, subjugating these native people. Here's the thing, like over half of Congo's native population will die under Belgian control. Yeah, we use this as a case study. This is going on all over Africa. We'll look at Germany and Britain and some other examples of stuff like this. But it was a really rough conditions for some of these natives who are working palm oil plantations, rubber plantations, who are mining the gold and the diamonds. It's just a really bad time. But you need to know Leopold II and the Belgian Congo, and specifically the harsh treatment on the rubber plantations there. Let's take a look at a term that we are not new to, social Darwinism. Remember this idea that comes from Charles Darwin. So he noticed that certain species and subspecies got to pass on their traits because they were better adapted to the environment, right? He called this natural selection. And so they say, okay, let's just take those same ideas and put them in the social realm. And so white people are successful in Europe because they have better traits. So it's our job to work those better traits. And hey, if we have some time and some money, we'll go and help the people who are not as evolved as us, right? They call this the white man's burden. It's the white man's burden to go and help these people who can't help themselves, right? Remember we looked at Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. The idea is that we need to, as one writer said, civilize the dark continent. We need to bring in culture, technology, religion, education. These people can't do it themselves. And they really meant this, like we talked about it in a very racist way, and it was racist. It's not okay, but they honestly were very well-meaning. I'm not making an excuse for it, but you can imagine going someplace and saying, they don't have running water, let's help them out. Okay, and there was advancements there in technology, like plumbing and roads, new medicine techniques, science and education, Enlightenment ideas for sure. But historians will argue, okay, at what cost? So today, a lot of these places in Africa are still pretty rough, right? Even though they had a lot of the good from imperialism. So some historians will say, well, the problem is imperialism ain't that good. And we actually hampered their self-development with imperialism. We'll look at this later, especially in the next unit when we talk about decolonization stuff in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But just keep that in mind that, okay, yeah, there was some good, but at what cost? Like, okay, we have railroads in the Congo now, but do we need to killed 12 million people, half the native population. You know, it's just stuff like that. Not, there was some good, a lot of not good though. And that's how history is, right? You need to be able to argue both sides of the coin. And so a lot of this idea that we are supposed to help everyone and help Africa originally starts with the abolition movement, right? Okay, that's good. We're abolishing slavery. Remember, UK ends it in its empire in 1833. The US in 1865. The final big one, Brazil, 1888. And so the UK and the USA are going to work together, and other countries like France are going to work together to shut down slaving ships and the slave trade. They build up their navies to do so, but here's the problem. So then they start to think, well, okay, we have a right and a moral obligation to interfere in Africa for other stuff too. So it's like, okay, we did a good thing. Let's see how many more good things we can do. Well, again, like I said, how good were they, right? And so the UK, you kind of looked at that imperial map of the UK. It's got stuff everywhere, colonies everywhere. And there's almost an unbroken chain all the way from Egypt to South Africa. And there was a British guy, his name was Cecil Rhodes, and he was an imperialist. And he said, we need to have a railroad that runs from Cape, from the bottom to the top, to Cairo. And so, but here's the problem. They were blocked by one colony. That was German East Africa. So the British and the Germans, they are not really friends, and they are kind of going at it. And we'll see some more tensions rise. Now, the Europeans, you can see some depictions here, are going to co-opt and train a lot of these native elites, kind of like the Zamindars in India. And they'll get them involved in the military and government in various ways. A lot of it's really demeaning. But the thing is, if I can use native people to run the show, then there's kind of a degree of separation, and maybe people will listen to natives who are on our side, right? That's the idea. And the same, like white man's burden, the social Darwinism in France is going on too in their colonies. And La Mission Silvestre, sorry, literally translates to the civilizing mission. It was their, like a mission, that word has religious connotations, to change, to civilize the dark continent, right? So there was a lot of good. There was a lot of bad too. Don't forget the bad or the good. So let's look at some of these last conflicts and stuff from around all over Africa. So in Sudan, which is just south of Egypt, refer back to your map. You have the map in your reading too. There is a revolt by a group of Muslims who are led by who they believe is the Mahdi. I don't know if you remember, but we talked about the differences in Sunni and Shia. This was a long time ago. But many Muslims believe that it will be like a Jesus figure, or to the Jews, the Messiah, who will come back and save them, unify them, and fight for them. And that's called the Mahdi. And so their leader claims to be the Mahdi. In fact, that's what historians call him, the Mahdi. And he leads this uprising against the British in Egypt and Sudan. We call this the Mahdist Wars. And they actually obliterate brutally the British at their capital at Khartoum. And what happens is it takes like 13, 15 years for the British to recoup from this, and they come back and they destroy them at Omdurman. Famously, Winston Churchill is there, right? He was very pro-imperialism. We'll get to that later. But then they're able to crush the Mahdist rebellion in 1898 and further the grip on Sudan and Egypt. Again, another example of a millenarian revolt. And this next revolt is not millenarian. It was just a straight up war between the Wasulu Empire in West Africa and their emperor. His name was Samori Toure, and they called the war the Mandingo War. That's what historians still call it, though Mandingo kind of has a bad connotation. We don't really say that word anymore. But the French will ultimately defeat them by 1898, solidifying control in West Africa. Now, the Maji Maji is another example of a millenarian revolt. So if we go down to Germany, who's controlling German East Africa, modern day Tanzania, and modern day Namibia, German Southwest Africa, again, refer to your map. But they are committing some of the first what historians, they debate the first instances of it. But a lot of people agree that Germany will commit some of the first atrocities like genocide and the use of concentration camps. Germany will keep doing this for some time. Keep that in mind. Against the people here. So in German East Africa, Zanzibar, that area, there is a rebellion called the Maji Maji Rebellion. And they believe that if they drank a spiritually blessed water, it would protect them from bullets. And so a lot of people are going around and drinking this water. Well, it didn't work, and a lot of them died. I'm just saying what it is. And so Germany crushes that rebellion. I think actually it's put down by 1898 too, or at least around that time. And then right after the turn of the century, they have to do the same thing with committing genocide and concentration camps in modern day Namibia, German Southwest Africa. And we call this the Herero Wars. The people there were called the Herero, and over 80% of them are killed. Like, it is a genocide if there ever was one, right? Now, they're not the only ones to use concentration camps. The British do too. And so the European situation in Africa is the tensions are only going to grow, especially after Germans come out in support of the Boers, who, remember, had made the great trek away from the new British colonies. They decide to get in a fight. They decide to stand up for their land and their people. And so the British and the Boers start fighting big time, and that's called the Boer War, because the British are trying to consolidate and control South Africa. They put down the Zulu. Now let's take care of the Boers. And so the British will actually use concentration camps as well, and put like over 100,000 people in these camps. Something like 20,000 of them die. It's very bad too. So the British are not off the hook on atrocities as well. But Germany and Germany will actually help the Boers militarily and what's the word? Foreign policy wise, right? And so it's kind of like a term historians may call a proxy war. Not really yet, but it's two people who they are against each other, but having someone else do the fighting. Keep that term in mind, just not yet. And so Germany and Britain, the tensions are only heating up there, and they start building up their military. They get into a naval race. Who's got the biggest, the baddest, the fastest, the most ships? And there is a new ship called the Dreadnought. We had looked at a picture of those, I believe. If not, we'll look at one later. But that's the Dreadnought, new steel battleship, guns everywhere. I mean, they are getting in a naval arms race. Germany ain't going to get behind Britain, but Britain don't want to get behind Germany. And so they keep building up this large military. One day they're going to have to use that. Keep that in mind. But anyway, here's some pictures here. This guy in the middle, you see my mouse, that's Samori Touré, the leader of the Wasulu Empire, who was defeated at the hands of the French in West Africa. You see here a depiction of a modest rebellion here, the British, who are fighting the modest there in Sudan. Now, this is a picture from German East Africa near Zanzibar of the Maji Maji rebellion's followers being chained and sent to a concentration camp. That's pretty rough right there. And the concentration camps weren't nice. I mean, people died in them, right? Now, this is a depiction. This isn't in Europe. Look at this. This is actually in German Southwest Africa, where you have German soldiers here who have hanged these Herero people. It's pretty rough stuff. And then a depiction of the Boer War. You have Boers here fighting the British. Like I said earlier, in the Boer War, British will start changing. Let's not wear red with giant white X's on our hearts, right? Let's start wearing khaki colors to blend in. Machine guns would be used really for war big time for the first time, and then concentration camps as well. And I didn't get a picture of the Dreadnought in here. I wasn't thinking of it, but look up Dreadnought and you'll see that. So, okay. Well, guys, that is it. Again, if you have your packet, if you have your reading, read. That is essential. If you haven't, when we get back, you need to get caught up in your reading. Watch this, take notes over it, watch it again. I'll put on YouTube, of course, and I will post it in the remind. But I hope you guys stay safe, stay warm. We probably won't be here tomorrow. I'll get East Asia up as soon as I can. Okay. Thank you very much. And stop recording. Okay. See ya. Bye.